We will absolutely share a copy of this recording as well as the research report that we'll be covering today, as well as the presentation. So that will happen following the webinar. So as you know, today we'll be digging a little bit deeper into how Canada's national media are covering climate change and solutions to climate change. I think for many of us, and certainly over the past couple of weeks, it's become very apparent that we often live in a fragmented media landscape. People are receiving information from different platforms, different regions, different organizations on different topics. And for many of us who spend our time thinking about climate change, it's often easy to imagine that our version of stories and narrative is the only version of story and narrative that's happening. And so what we like to do and what we wanted to do is to step back, take a look at what is the public narrative within Canada's national media, and to look through the noise and to look at the signals and the patterns. And so I'm really delighted to say that we have three excellent speakers today, two of which authored the report itself, and others who are experts in media. I think that for those of you who have joined us before for some of our reports, it's no secret that Canadian public opinion, and particularly there are some concerning trends in a decline in concern. I think many people report a sense of polarization or uncertainty around some of the ways that we talk about climate change, and uncertainty around who to believe and whatnot. So what we want to do is just to take a look at who are the media, who is showing up in Canadian media, what are the voices that are being foregrounded, how are the Canadian media talking about climate change and solutions, and to draw some connections between what we might see within broader trends and the patterns that we see within stories and narrative. So each year, Re.Climate takes a look at media, and so this is our third report. So we'll be also talking about some of the trends that we see year over year. And for this year, our team looked at 16,000 different articles and did a deep dive on some, and the researchers will talk a little bit more about the methodology. Just to say that we will be having a moment for questions at the end. We've certainly taken a look at some of the questions that you've highlighted within the media or when you registered. But we'll have a moment at the end of the webinar to field some of the questions. We're going to use the Q&A function to do that. So we won't be tracking the chat, but we'll be using the Q&A to source your questions. And if you like, you can always upvote so we can see if there are more than one of you holding the same question. And we'll get to those at the end. We have just over 75 minutes together. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and speakers for today, and then we'll get into the report and the discussion. So I'm delighted to say that we have Chris Hatch, who is a strategic consultant on energy and climate change. He's the former executive editor of the National Observer and was previously executive director of the Rainforest Action Network. He also authors one of Canada's top climate newsletters, Zero Carbon, where he sorts through news and ideas and politics and culture to figure out what's working on the race against climate change. We also have Dr. Ghadah Alrasheed, who leads our research and knowledge mobilization at Re.Climate and develops resources, evidence-based tools, and training programs for our network of more than 4,500 climate communicators across the country. She has a PhD in communications and a wealth of experience spanning the academic, federal, and NGO sectors, and she brings a unique understanding of effective research and knowledge mobilization practice in climate communications. And then finally, we have Re.Climate Strategic Services Director, Jen Mayville. She's a senior communications leader and strategist who brings a wealth of experience in marketing, communications, and media relations to Re.Climate. During her career, she has worked in humanitarian, environmental, and social service sectors and is passionate about creating communication strategies that help motivate change. Jen also holds a master's in journalism and was a practicing journalist. So once again, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. Please use the Q&A function for your questions. And I will hand it over to you, Chris, to kick us off and lead us through the report findings.
Great, thank you, Amber. Just to start off very quickly, on the first slide I'm going to show, you'll see that what you're going to hear about and not hear about, and specifically we're looking at national media outlets operating in English. We picked 6 of the biggies and the wire stories that they republish. We looked at everything that they covered to do with climate coverage earlier this year. We pick a time period that's not part of the UN Climate Convention and it's not part of wildfire season, so we can sort of get a sense of the general background narratives that we feel are fairly constant. And then we take a sampling of coverage during wildfire season and also from that same period earlier in the year, where we looked in detail at a random sample of stories about wildfires and about solutions. So all of that from the 6 large national media outlets. So what you're not hearing about today are narratives and results in Quebec, Francophone, broadcast media, regional media, podcasts, things like that, or social media. So, a lot of narratives out there that we're not going to be capturing. This is just the sort of elite media operating in English, which is still pretty important, although less important than it once was, because it's the stuff that lands on the desks of decision makers every morning. And it is also the basis of a lot of what gets shared around and talked about in other platforms. Next slide, you'll see how you can get a copy of the full report. And let's get into it. The kind of surprising news actually is that in general, coverage is going up. So climate change gets mentioned more often by the national media, 30% more frequently over the last 2 years than before. And generally speaking, the sort of questioning about whether climate change is happening is almost non-existent. And there's also a widespread acceptance that we need to be acting on it, that something needs to be done. The notable exception to this is Post Media, the National Post and Financial Post, especially their opinion sections, where they quite regularly argue that action is more expensive than what it's worth. But everywhere else, science is accepted, the need for action is accepted. So moving to the next slide, this looks a little bit like more of an increase than it really is, because you'll notice the y-axis doesn't go to 0. But the point being that even though climate change may be slipping in priority for the public, it is actually increasing in frequency in the national media. On the next slide, you'll see how that stacks up relative to other issues. Roughly on par with mental health, not far behind healthcare. So pretty significant issue actually in the national media. Quick note here, you'll notice that immigration has jumped from almost nowhere on the radar a couple of years ago to bigger deal than climate change now. What you will find though is that climate change is it's frequently mentioned, it's embedded itself into the fabric of the national media conversation, but it really lacks context. So climate impacts are still very rarely connected to climate change. Climate change is usually talked about, when we talk about the carbon tax or solutions to climate change, it's never really within the frame of climate change. So the carbon tax is a political controversy, but it usually in a vacuum from the issue it's supposed to address. And even more fundamentally problematic is that the current situation with climate change, its causes and its fundamentals are almost always absent. So you don't hear that burning fossil fuels causes climate change. You don't hear that once the carbon is emitted, it just it's up there forever. It's a cumulative problem. It's not like air pollution where we can reduce emissions and that makes it go away. You don't hear how big Canada is in context, that we're about the 11th largest emitter in the world. We're one even bigger emitter in terms of historical emissions, which, because of the cumulative nature of the problem, is really what matters. You don't hear how far along we are towards hitting the temperature targets that we said we would hit. We would stay below. You don't hear how far along we were in terms of making the cuts we had promised to make. Here on the next slide, you'll see how the connections play out in terms of climate impacts. Really notable here that actually, in terms of wildfires and extreme heat, the connection when the media covers heat waves or wildfires, the number of times they make a connection to climate change has actually decreased in the last year, and it was never in majority territory anyway. Next slide. You'll see that I won't dwell on this. It just gives you a taste of what's in the bigger report, share of voice. The conversation is generally happening within a bubble of politicians, government, business, technocratic, independent voices. Health professionals are much less frequently quoted than you'd expect or want. In the next slide, here's the really key thing. So a fair amount of coverage of climate change, but in terms of informing the public about why it's happening, what's causing it, the most common cited cause is greenhouse gases, which is of course abstract and means almost nothing to almost everyone. And even then it's mentioned, you can see, far less frequently than climate change itself. So there's rarely a mention of the cause, and when any kind of tangible cause that would mean something to someone, like fossil fuel burning, is not even 1 in 10. Next slide, please. One thing that really jumped out, you'll see that natural gas is a huge story. The narrative used to be mostly about oil and gas industry. The media is much more focused now, almost twice as much, on natural gas. And here again, only about a fifth of the time that the media covers natural gas do they talk about fossil fuels in the context of climate change. So on to the next, and it's over to Ghadah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for the presentation. I'd like to take some time to focus actually in what I'm going to present on what we have observed in the media's coverage of climate solutions. And specifically, we asked these questions in our research. What kind of solutions are being covered? How are these solutions being covered? Who's speaking about these solutions? And maybe just more importantly, who isn't part of this conversation around solutions? And these are important questions because they show us the ways in which media shape how people understand and trust climate solutions. And I want to, of course, acknowledge that climate change can be overwhelming. We bear witness to its devastating effects on our communities and ecosystems. But when we talk about solutions, it's not about only guiding us to what should be done, but it's a conversation that offers hope, and we really need hope. When we talk about climate change, it reminds us that progress is possible, especially if we choose the right solutions at work. And so it gives people a lot of empowerment and self-efficacy to take action. So what did we find? If we go back to the previous slide, and just so I'm going to move to the next, is that we analyzed how media covers solutions, and one clear trend that has emerged, that lots of stories focused on technological solutions. This means that coverage is largely about technological innovations, and while these are important, they're just one part of a much bigger picture. What we didn't see much coverage of was climate policies, nature-based solutions, or how people, everyday citizens, engage around climate action. These are vital pieces of the puzzle that we didn't see much coverage of. If we go to the next slide, we'll see here that this chart shows the degree of the coverage of different climate solutions or climate technologies. And at a glance, you can see that electric vehicles get the most coverage, and then they're followed by renewables. But it's also striking how much focus hydrogen is getting in national media coverage. It's become a major talking point, often positioned as a key piece of the energy transition. We also noticed in our research that carbon capture and storage gets quite attention, more than solutions like wind and solar. EVs have dominated the coverage of climate solutions for years, and that continued in 2024. But the coverage in 2024 was really negative. The narratives around EVs were critical, with a strong focus on the challenges and struggles the industry was facing. For example, there's been a lot of attention on their high cost, delays in EV production because of workforce issues, issues with reliability, with maintenance, and how much stress EVs place on electric grids and other infrastructure needs. And after electric vehicle, the most covered category in climate technologies is renewables, but it's often used as a broad and vague category. So if you look for specific solutions that to like wind and solar, then the numbers just drop down drastically. As I mentioned, hydrogen is also getting attention, but that coverage of hydrogen doesn't clarify much about how hydrogen is made, or the details about the different types of hydrogen. And from what we know is that a lot of hydrogen isn't low carbon capture, but there's really little mention of technological and environmental challenges of using hydrogen as an energy source. You look here at this chart, it is about the climate policies and the degree of coverage of different climate policies. And in general, climate policies get far less attention than climate technologies. And as you see also in the chart here, the carbon tax overshadows other policies like emissions cap or clean electricity standards. So there's really a big gap between the carbon tax policy and other policies. Now, the key issue with the carbon tax coverage is that the policy is not framed as a climate policy, but more of a political battle. So only about 1/3 of carbon tax stories usually connected to climate change. A bit more or less in CBC, the Globe and Mail, and National Post. And so most stories frame it as a point of contention between political parties, emphasizing the conflict around the policy rather than its role as a climate policy. There's, however, one exception. I would say is like the Toronto Star, where about 3/4 of their carbon tax stories link the policy to climate change. This bar chart shows the proportion of stories that mention climate change when they cover different solutions. So as you see here in the chart, for green energy overall, which is on the far left of this chart, about 39% of these stories make that connection between green energy and climate change. Now, for specific renewables, again, the number drops. It's just about 80% of solar energy stories and 20% of wind energy frame these technologies as climate measures. And now, what kind of stood out is that the proportion of stories that link carbon capture storage to climate change, the connection is the highest among all these technologies. Carbon capture storage is expensive, requires significant amount of energy to operate, demand massive infrastructure. So there are challenges, but despite of these, the technology is still framed as a climate solution, more than wind and more than solar. Also for hydrogen, which faces its own challenges, it still makes the connection in 30% of its stories. One of the things that we noticed is that it's rare for stories to name names when it comes to addressing the burning of fossil fuels, even when the story is about what to do about climate change. So less than 20% of climate action stories mention fossil fuels directly, although burning fossil fuels account for 90% of carbon emissions, but there's a lot of hesitancy of highlighting the importance of moving away from fossil fuels. And instead, the more abstract terms are used more often, such as energy transition and net zero. And the problem with these terms is that they don't always spell out what's needed to be done to move from one point A to point B. So I'd say it's like the public are left a bit in the dark about what really energy transition mean. And it's, where's the move from what point to what point? So we looked at different climate solutions, but also we looked in the research who is brought in this conversation about solutions and who's talking about these solutions. And as many of you know, this really matters because who's speaking about climate and climate solutions plays a role in how people trust and understand different climate actions. So are we hearing from scientists, from policymakers, from industry leaders or politicians? And as you see in the chart, the most dominant voice in the conversation about climate solution are business leaders, spanning all sectors. They're followed by politicians and those who hold political office, such as MPs, ministers, premiers, and then government agencies and civil servants, those working, outside the public eye, such as government analysts, administrators, or managers. And obviously here, as it's clear in the chart, Indigenous voices and health professionals are far less represented in the coverage, lagging behind other voices. So there's definitely a technocratic pattern that shapes the types of conversations, but also who's included in these conversations. And just I want to conclude that, I think it's just if we want to build trust and inspire action, there's a need to amplify different voices and identities, engage in this conversation with the work of highlighting proven climate actions and policies. Thank you. I'll hand it to you, Amber.
Thank you, Ghadah, and thank you, Chris, for that important work, and also just a shout out to the other two members of Re.Climate who supported that, Emma Bider and Niv as well. So thank you all. So now we have a moment to offer some reflections, and having weeded through over 16,000 stories and done a deep dive to hear your thoughts on kind of what you're taking away from it and what it means for you. I can see that people are already using the Q&A function. So if you have questions, please, I encourage you to ask those in the Q&A, and we'll have some time after this discussion to get to those, as well as the questions that were fielded when you registered. So I think let's open it up. Chris, as somebody who spends a lot of time, I think, with both in the newsletter that you produce, as well as, you know, looking at this report, as well as being a journalist for many, many years. Curious what you think, how climate change and how it's reported is shaping how the public understands and their literacy and even how urgent they think it is.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really significant factor. We have like a real problem in terms of climate literacy in Canada. I mean, and you know, I would say around the world, but all we can really do about it is here in Canada. And it's actually worse here than other places. But so it goes back to this, the way that the media doesn't contextualize climate change and doesn't frame it and doesn't unpack it. It's just like, it's this topic hanging in midair or in a vacuum. And, you know, I hit a couple of points early on, but, you know, the media doesn't talk about how big of a contribution Canada is making to the problem. It doesn't talk about the status of climate change in terms of how far, how deep in trouble we are, and how slowly we're making progress to come out of it. And it doesn't get at, like, if you're a normal person that isn't diving into climate change regularly, what you really need to know is the basic shape of the problem. It's like, what causes it? What would it take to solve it? And on those are really two of the things we dove into in this report and in general, because the main cause, like 3/4 of the cause, is the burning of fossil fuels and the carbon pollution that comes out of that, fossil fuel pollution. And the fact that that stays in the atmosphere basically forever in human terms, you know, hundreds or thousands, up to 1,000 years. And so, you know, the media likes to look at measures that reduce emissions, for example, but never unpacks, or almost never unpacks, the fact that fossil fuel pollution needs to go effectively to zero, or climate change just keeps on getting worse until it does. And the basic fact that it's not about greenhouse gas emissions, which means nothing to the public, but making it much more tangible. Like it's the fossil fuels that are burned in factories and burned in our cars and by the oil and gas industry to produce the oil in the first place. And I think that for communicators, you know, we can't in every story and every interview get into all of the context that the media should be covering. But I think it's really important to at least pick one element of the cause or the dynamics of the problem and really trying to drill into it with the interviewer or the reporter. And of course, you know, different contexts, you're going to have, you know, either, you know, radio interview where you have a lot of time to talk, or in the national media, you're really only going to get one quote. So thinking really clearly about how to embed some meaning making in that quote that the reporters are going to use, because it's that sense of meaning, I think, that's what's really lacking. And that's what's really not helping public literacy around what causes climate change and what it would take to stop it.
Yeah, thank you. Great points. Jen, as somebody who's worked on both sides of the desk, both as a journalist as well as a communication strategist, and knowing that we have many comms people on the call here today, just curious what advice you might have and how climate communicators can better work with the media to change the ways in which climate change is reported and address some of the points that Chris has just raised as well as have been raised in the report.
Hi, everyone. I think this is a really great question, and Chris already raised some great points. So I'm just going to tack on to what he's already said. There are a number of things that communications practitioners can do to help improve climate change reporting in Canada. Just to go over a few of them, the first of all one is to build trusted relationships with journalists. So provide them with the latest research, update them on policy developments, inform them of the latest trends, so they are in the loop about what's happening. In addition to that, we really have to understand the needs of journalists and what's happening with the media sector in Canada. The media sector in Canada has shifted dramatically, especially in the last few years. And I'm sure many of you have seen stories in the media about layoffs in newsrooms or even newsrooms closing. It means that newsrooms have less capacity and as well, less staff, less reporters, and less specialized reporters. And in case of local media as well, a lot of you are going to be working with probably general assignment reporters that just don't have the bandwidth to go deep on climate change every day. They're working on different stories every day. So we can help them. We can help them better understand what's going on in the climate sphere in Canada by providing them with backgrounders, fact sheets, as well as when we're distributing press releases, having easy to pull quotes. And then also we can provide visuals for stories. And I'm sure many of you have already heard about Climate Outreach. They're a great organization in the UK. They have a program called Climate Visuals. If you visit their website, they have 7 principles for visual climate communications. So that would be a great place to go for guidance on types of images to provide the media. As well, we need to have more voices. So as Ghadah and Chris already showed in their analysis, right now, the media continue to turn to politicians and government when it comes to this issue, as well as industry. These are people that Canadians don't trust when it comes to climate change. Some professionals that they do trust are health care providers and frontline responders like firefighters. And they also want to hear directly from the people who are impacted by climate change. So it'd be good for you to think about how to include some of these voices within your media relations outreach. For example, if you're having a press conference, could you include one of them in your press conference and have them speak? If you're issuing a press release, can you include a quote from them? If you're writing an op-ed, could it be co-authored with one of them? And you need to make sure also that they are media trained and ready to go when a media opportunity strikes. Also, I'm sure many of us are already doing that, but correcting misinformation. So monitoring what is in the media cycle. And if we are seeing any misrepresentations or inaccuracies, then we need to reach out to journalists and ask them to correct the information. And we also need to provide clear and scientifically backed evidence to help counter any misleading narratives that are in the media. And then also, as Chris already mentioned, we need to continue to underscore in our communications the causes of climate change. And that leading cause is the burning of fossil fuels like oil and gas and coal. And then also Canada's place in the world and that we are one of the biggest polluters, and we're not doing our part compared to our peers, including the US, which have reduced their fossil fuel pollution. So I think all of these tactics are a really great place to start to help shift how climate change is reported in Canada.
Thanks, Jen. So what I've taken away from Chris is more context. I'm hearing loud and clear to better include the cause of climate change and what's driving climate change versus the burning of fossil fuels. And then Jen, some great tips around building relationships, not only with journalists, but also with new voices. Having materials ready to go, having people ready to go, so that when those stories and the interest spikes for media, that we're ready to work with them. So thank you very much. I'm going to now open it up. I can see out of the corner of my eye, there are 38 questions that have come through. So I think we'll start first with a few of the questions that came through when people registered, and then we will move to some of the questions that are coming through in real time. So Ghadah, the first question, and I think that there was one that opened up, is really around this tension between the new media landscape and legacy media. I know that your doctoral work actually looked at what the role media plays in social and political change, and how new media are used by niche groups or by special interest groups. And so I'm just curious if you could offer some thoughts on what you think the role of and how much legacy media matters today in this context of podcasts and newsletters and social media.
Oh, thank you, Amber. And this is really a great question. It's very timely given what is, what we have witnessed lately. And it's definitely, the media landscape has been evolving since the invention of radio. New medias have always emerged. And so there's always the conversation about our old media eclipsing and new media emerging. And so there's this question about, and sometimes it getting polarized about, do we need to focus on different types of media and just, forget but radio is one of the media that has been there for years and years and years. And still we listen to radio, and it evolved into podcasting. And so I want to first is just when we talk about media, I think we should be looking at it as more of like an ecosystem rather than it's just this or that, but rather it's what does new media do and what changes does, and how still old and legacy media affect that ecosystem. And of course, it's like, all the media are facing challenges, things that have been already, like Jen has mentioned, about shrinking budget and shrinking revenues. And these are legitimate challenges. But if we look at what is happening, we find, legacy media play a huge role in amplifying stories that are shared on social media, and legitimizing and validating these stories. Mm-hmm. And so they are part of this. So, they don't operate like separately. And beside that, there's a lot of legacy media still matters because of the role and of their role in fostering accountability and in fostering a dialogue that holds politicians accountable and polluters accountable, and that can't be done with really with the new media. So they still matter. And they matter because of all the expertise and the track record and all the experience that has come with, that professionals have. So just in short, legacy media matter. There's definitely a lot of changes, but they're still part of the ecosystem, and also we should fight to maintain their role. And that's what the goal of our webinar today is, just to hold them accountable as well, because we need them, and we need them for democracy.
Great, thank you. Good points. So I think what I took away from what you were saying is that they're a part of an ecosystem, and that there's a lot of actual exchange between the new media landscape and legacy media, and that there's often a conversation and a relationship happening between the two. Great, thank you. Chris, this one's for you. What are your thoughts on the potential consequences if public or local media were to lose funding? There's been some rumors of this, or a sense of that, and what it might mean. I think Ghadah's just put it on the table, what it might mean for democracy and climate change when institutions like these face financial and funding shortcuts.
Yeah, well, it's a problem much broader than climate change. You probably have heard that there's a lot of funding now going, well, I don't say a lot, but there's federal funding now going to keeping legacy media floating. What's less well understood, I think, is that a lot of local media is funded through a separate federal track, the Local Journalism Initiative, which, at least in my view, has been really useful because it targets right into communities that are underserved and allows independent reporters in some cases, or local news outlets, to keep reporters that cover local stories, cover City Hall, all that kind of classic kind of coverage. And it's very likely that those programs would be axed under a new government. Certainly, the broader ones, keeping legacy media subsidized, and probably in the side, the Local Journalism Initiative would go away too. So, in terms of getting impacted voices, it's often local media that go to health professionals, for example, because it's like, what's the wildfire smoke doing for my kids' asthma kind of thing, which is inherently kind of a local concern. And same with Indigenous voices. What's happening, what's the impact of wildfire or the flood on a particular Indigenous community is more likely to get covered in local and regional media. So yeah, I mean, I'm building up to saying that I think it's a very significant problem, and I wish I had better answers for what we do about it, other than to raise the importance of local media in the national conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I know certainly,
and
in
there
some of
is,
the work.
I was just going to say, we put out to review this report, from various people, and a bunch of people came back saying, one of the things we need to be doing as advocates and communicators on climate change is to make a point of amplifying really good stories and really good local stories, because the editors and the publishers pay a lot of attention to their metrics, both in terms of quality and quantity of readership. And it can really help to see that something is being taken seriously and getting spread around.
Yeah, so a call to action, I guess, for folks here. When you see stories that are well done, or that you think are relevant to your work, to actually amplify those. They matter to editors, and they matter to the outlets who are publishing them. Thanks. Jen, a question here was around the growing urgency of climate crisis and what you think needs to change in terms of how Canadian media organizations prioritize and report on climate issues. As somebody who's been behind the scenes and has a sense of how decisions are made and editorial decisions are made, curious what you think about that.
Yeah, climate change is an issue that's affecting all Canadians. It's an issue that's affecting us right now. I think that newsrooms need to do more to connect the dots. We've mentioned this before between the causes of climate change and also can talk about solutions. And then also make those connections between other issues that are happening in Canada and climate change, like affordability, like economic growth, like health, the health and well-being of Canadians, even housing, which is a huge crisis within our country. We also need to be talking about how can we build all these homes that we need in a sustainable way. I think that news outlets are already covering many of these intersectionalities, as Ghadah and Chris's research showed, but they're not making those connections with climate change. So they're already doing the work to talk about the carbon tax. They're already doing the work to talk about extreme weather, but they're not making that other step. So I think that really needs to be a priority.
Thank you. One for you, Ghadah, as somebody who is doing the actual research, what are the types of solutions? And I think that maybe you and Chris have a perspective on this from the media analysis or from the public opinion analysis that we've done as well. What types of solutions are people most skeptical about? Not sure if you've found some of that echoed within the media report.
Yeah, well, I can answer this question from what we did in our last public opinion roll-up, and there was definitely a decline in support for the carbon tax policy. In last year's report, we found actually the policy lost support even among staunch supporters, such as the Liberal voters who were higher their support. And I believe that the surveys from 2024 confirmed that decline in support for the policy. I think just for the media analysis, I would phrase the question differently, because we don't know about if people are skeptical, but we know like what got less coverage. And I would see I would say that EVs were the most covered, but at the same time, there's a lot of negative coverage. So it felt like a celebrity where there's a lot of exposure, and and that's a good thing. But then it's been under too much scrutiny in in the way that it's operated. And so yeah, I would say that EVs, from the media analysis, that EVs seem to be the solution that got a lot of critical coverage this
Yeah,
year.
we can't have EVs canceled. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other one, the other one is that wind seems to be getting more and more negative coverage. And I think, this is beyond the scope of this report, but my sense of looking at regional media is that's even more the case. The regional media is, covering opposition to wind farms, especially in Atlantic Canada and other places. Yeah, and on EVs, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think part of the problem that we have is that the media, what the media wants to cover is something new, right? So for a long time, EVs were sort of coming on stream, and then the natural thing is to like, okay, well, what's the problem with this new thing, right? And let's cover that. So in part, I think it's just a phase we're going to have to go through. They need the controversy in order to drive media coverage. But I do think that it's not factually based, in the sense that it's another context problem. Like, EV sales are setting records quarter by quarter by quarter. It's just that the rate of growth has slowed from the same quarter last year. So whenever we can push back on those kinds of things, that's the kind of thing the media is really very sensitive to. Like, reporters accuracy in reporting is something that's like, a real high value to reporters themselves. So when it can be shown that they're actually getting something like that wrong, that's a much bigger issue than they're not contextualizing or framing in a more abstract way.
Okay. All right, so we have a number of questions that are coming through from the chat or from the Q&A. This is a question from Seniors for Climate in Victoria for Jen. Any advice on getting opinion pieces published in media outlets like the Globe and Mail or others?
Great question, and I hope everyone here is thinking about writing op-eds. A few tips is one, keep on top of what's happening in the media cycle, and ideally your op-ed is tied to something that's being discussed in the news right now. And when you're writing your op-ed, you want to make sure you're bringing to the table a really unique point of view and that it has a strong opinion. The media for op-eds, they don't really want sort of a passive opinion, they want a strong opinion. And you also want to back up your opinion with evidence as well when writing your piece. Every outlet in the country has a different word count for op-ed, so take a look for the publication that you're interested in pitching your op-ed to see how long your op-ed should be. It can be a very strict word count, so if you are over that, they might just reject your piece based on that. And then also, if your piece gets rejected by one publication, you can approach another one to try to pitch it there. There have been occasions when I've written op-eds that haven't landed anywhere that I ended up using it as a blog on the organization's website that I've been working for. And then every outlet's also different, like the Globe in particular, I know you asked about that. They like to be pre-pitched on the op-ed versus you sending them one. So instead of wasting your time writing an op-ed that the Globe might not be interested in, it might be better to pitch them first to gauge their interest on that.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Really good tips. Question from Suzanne Crawley for Ghadah here. Given that social media and podcasts are a part of the media ecosystem, as we've talked about, is there a plan to analyze these, especially as a major source of our big problem, which is misinformation? So Ghadah, any plans for Re.Climate to do an analysis of the kind of new media landscape?
Yeah, well, definitely. That is something that is on our radar, and we plan to expand the media analysis to include broadcast and social media. But also, I would like to direct people to Dr. Chris Russell's research, who's our academic director. And Dr. Chris Russell did a lot of work on misinformation. And here at Re.Climate, we released a report called Flame Wars, which looks at misinformation during wildfires here in Canada and how did it play in social media. I'd like to invite my colleagues to share the link in the chat, but this is a valuable source if you want to look at how misinformation plays out in social media and who's part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Marcia from the University of Waterloo asks Chris, how can we work to promote critical thinking and rebuild public trust in science? Advice for diffusing politically charged talks.
Well, I think that, where my mind goes for the purposes of this is that, we're talking about national media, we're talking about, the group of us here today, climate communicators. So I think it is totally fair to push on any reporter that you're talking to about the need for framing and context. It's not part of the interview that's going to make it into the final piece, but my experience with reporters and, in doing this research over the last few years, is that reporters as a sort of group of people actually really get, they're really worried about climate change. They wish there was more coverage of climate change. In a sense, you're pushing on an open door. You can have this conversation with the reporters themselves. The problem is more sort of structural in the industry and what the editors are willing to, put staff time onto. So I think, for the narrow purposes of this conversation today, we're not going to get into what the educational system ought to be teaching kids, although that's obviously, a place this question could go. I really would encourage people to have this sort of, it's not a background conversation with a reporter, it's just, saying like, this is not getting covered and we've got to figure out a way to weave it into the fabric of the stories.
Yeah, thank you. Just noting that Emma has updated the link for those of you who were going to the Flame Wars report. So there's a new link in the chat there. There's an anonymous attendee who has also asked Chris and Ghadah, who are the voices that are most present in discussions about hydrogen? So I'm not sure if you've answered that already, but in the research, maybe I'll turn to you, Ghadah, to if you have any insights around who is most talking about hydrogen.
I think it was one of the things, because I remember like for wildfire voices and also for solutions in general, there is a dominance of one voice with another. I would say it's like, I think that hydrogen was one of those solutions where we found diversity of voices. I don't know why, but there was even like, there were indigenous voices that were even brought into the conversation about hydrogen. So I can't give like conclusion about just affirmative answer about who these voices were. But I remember the chart that we developed of the voice of the hydrogen. I remember I saw it's all different types of voices there. And I think that is interesting to dive into this of like who's talking and who's brought in. But I had a sense there was a bit of greenwashing, and the reasons that the different voices were brought in is to legitimize the technology. But again, something I would love for us to dig in and then share more about this.
Thank you.
Yeah, there were two very different narratives. Did you want to break for time?
No, I just wanted to make a note at the hour. We will go for 15 more minutes. So I encourage people to stay on. We'll still have, we'll continue to work our way through the questions. But yeah, Chris, over to you. If there were insights around the voices.
We looked at hydrogen and we looked at carbon capture as these two, unproven or more speculative kinds of solutions, to be polite. Hydrogen is very interesting because there's two very different kinds of stories going on. And one is hydrogen as this new developing industry, especially on the East Coast. And a lot of talk about new wind farms being built to produce hydrogen, largely to make ammonia for export or other kinds of export. And then there's the whole different kind of story, which is hydrogen as a solution for the oil and gas industry. And you see these stories particularly around Alberta and Saskatchewan, where it kind of fits the existing narrative of the government and the oil and gas industry, because it's another kind of fuel. They see it, right? It's like goes in pipes just like natural gas. You burn it just like oil and natural gas. So on the new kinds of hydrogen, the dominant voices were politicians and industry for sure, and then a broader spread, as Ghadah was saying. But it's very uninterrogated. Like, it's not the question of should we building all these new wind farms for some new export industry, or should we be building wind farms to decarbonize the existing grid gets very little attention. And on the oil and gas replacement side, Also, largely industry voices, technocratic conversation inside that bubble. And there, hydrogen, is already a problem. It's used in refineries, for example. It's made mostly from natural gas. It's its own cause of climate change in that way. And so just replacing the existing hydrogen supply is a huge project. And that also doesn't get any real interrogation.
Thanks, Chris. There is a question here from Kurnis from ICLEI asking Jen, do you have any tips to help local governments and local organizations pitch climate stories? So you've covered a little bit about op-eds and you've covered some general tips, but for local governments and local organizations, if you have any tips on pitching.
Yes, I do. When it comes to local media, you really want to focus on the local angles of the story. So, what are you seeing in your community? What are the impacts in your community as well? Because those reporters are really looking for how climate is impacting the people in your community. So you really want to get that local angle, and also you want to get spokespeople from your community who can, obviously you have decision makers from your community, but you also want to have people like community groups or local residents who can also share about their experience, or even local businesses and talking about how climate change is impacting them. Also, you really want to also make those connections. We talked a lot about new voices, but also making the connections to the causes of climate change and solutions, and then also talking about local solutions. I get this question a lot about, if the federal government is not doing X, Y, and Z, what can I do locally to make a difference? So talking about local solutions and what your municipal government and also local residents can do to help make a difference on climate changes, I think would also be really interesting to the local media.
Thank you, Jen. And just to note, in some of the work that we've been doing around wildfires, we also noted a difference between the media response and media cycle on national stories versus regional or local media. So local media tend to be interested in different topics when there's a unfolding natural disaster. Their story is focused more on the people who are impacted and the unfolding story, whereas national media tend to move on more quickly because it's not relevant to necessarily everybody in the country. So just tuning into kind of also what's the media cycle, and then noting all of the things that Jen said earlier too, around being ready, having those relationships in place, cultivating those relationships well in advance. Okay, Julia, here a question for either Chris or Ghadah. Is the reason that carbon capture and hydrogen stories are more often linked to climate change than solar wind is because fewer people are familiar with CCS and hydrogen, or because oil and gas is successfully marketing their story around these technologies? So is it, I think the question here is around that chart. Carbon capture and hydrogen seem to be more linked to climate change than green technologies. And is it because fewer people are familiar with it, so they're kind of unpacking it as a story and linking it to climate change? Or is it more, to your point, Ghadah, a matter of oil and gas companies and their marketing and communications prowess? So maybe I'll go to you first, Ghadah, and then Chris, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, okay, so I think it's just so there's also another answer that I think that could be, fossil fuel companies did a lot of work to promote carbon capture technology as the solution, as part of the energy transition, and that's definitely diluted the picture about solutions, and that's why we see the connection to climate change. But I think that, it's also about the point about lack of resources for journalists. And so if you put yourself in journal's shoes with like where you have to cover a story that you're not even a climate reporter, you're a political reporter or a finance reporter, but then you have to include the story about carbon capture, then you go to easy and accessible resources to kind of bring in that perspective of like, okay, what these technologies work. And so there are resources that are accessible that can tell people carbon capture is part of the solution. And this is something that, I mean, it's part of, it's not refuted by the government. It's not refuted. So it's something that has not been countered heavily by more authoritarian or more government voices, but it's more like I think it's advocated, but it's more like countered by NGOs or environmental organizations who always questioned and the carbon capture. So I think it's the so there's been a lot of greenwashing campaigning that is framed carbon capture, but I think it's also the issue about the complexity of this landscape and the conversation about climate solutions and climate change. And there is a need definitely to provide resources to kind of define what these solutions and whether they work or not work. And that will help those journals, again, especially who are not like specializing climate, to have a clear sense of what proven solutions are and what unproven solutions are.
Thank you. Chris, anything to add on that?
Well, one of the narratives that really does seem to be lacking to me is the question of how much public money is reasonable to put into CCS. And one of the underlying frames around CCS is that it's necessary. Not even always stated so explicitly, but it's absolutely sort of the common assumption is that we're not sure how to make it work, but it needs to work. That's sort of the overall frame of the story. That's something I think, to push back on more. But the other one, and the one that's I think more, mediagenic, is the question of how much public money, like how much taxpayer money really is reasonable to be putting into this, because that's obviously, feeds right into the national conversation right now about, inflationary pressures and, debt deficit, all that kind of thing. And it really can lead also to the question, what we're hearing a lot is that there's just not money. The government doesn't feel like it could do anything else on solutions because basically, the budgetary space is being taken up by these enormous tax incentives that they're going to allow for carbon capture.
Thank you. So we're going to be winding our way down. I'm going to let the panelists think what would be your top takeaway from today's conversation. And just before we get to that, we have one more question here. Again, this is going back to you, Ghadah. Very interesting to see so Ali says, very interesting to see the share of slide voice. Or share a voice slide, rather. I'm surprised not to see ENGOs mentioned. Did they appear in any stories? And I guess a question for all of you is, if not, why not? So Ghadah, first to you, what was the share of voice for ENGOs? And then you can maybe kick us off on your perspective on why or why not.
Well, I remember from the research, NGOs appeared in about 10% of the stories. So definitely not a big number. Why not? I'm not sure. I'd leave it to other experts who've been working in the sector for a longer time I mean, it could be, I don't want to give interpretations to why is this happening, but I think it's just, it's highlighted that NGOs need to work more on engaging with media, on providing resources for media. And I know that there's been some work, but there's more. There's a need for more to step up on that side and to have these relationship with media. And it's also a lot about storytelling and how to make these issues relevant. I think just the recommendations that Jen provided about how to engage media are important for all NGOs. So a lot of comms and media thinking that needs that NGOs need to pay attention to. What is just
Okay. Yeah, Chris, anything else that you would add to that, to Ghadah's remarks?
I think Ghada really covered it. I mean, as someone who works partly in and around journalism, I can tell you that it's just a bombardment of pitches and stories coming all the time. And the key thing is to make it easy for these journalists who, they're so understaffed now, newsrooms. They're probably covering even more than one story a day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So a lot of what I would say I get from NGOs is it's like way too much sort of opinion
Mm-hmm.
about stuff that's never going to make it into a quote. And it's really just to refine it down, provide the simple context and the simple quote, right? Without quite so much verbiage.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just looking at the time, I'm sorry, Jen, I'm going to actually close us down or close down the conversation now. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. As we mentioned, we will be sharing the report. We'll be sharing a copy of this recording, as well as the slide deck following the webinar. We also have a survey that will appear when the Zoom closes, and that's really helpful for us. The feedback that you provide us and the areas where you'd like to see new research and questions that you're holding really help to inform the work that we do throughout the year. So I encourage you to take a couple of minutes just to fill out that survey. If you have any questions about the methodology, or if you'd like to follow up with us directly, I encourage you to follow up with Ghada, and we'll pop her email into the chat here. Thank you again, Chris, for your work and for your thoughts today. Thank you, Jen, for your work and for your thoughts. And again, thank you, Ghada, for overseeing and leading this project. I'm just going to check my notes and make sure that I didn't miss anything that I was supposed to say. Yeah, finally, if you are not already following us, please do so on LinkedIn. And you can always join our mailing list on our website. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for your time. And we'll get more information out to you shortly, and have a good rest of your day.